The photograph appears ordinary at first, the sort of stiff, carefully arranged family portrait that fills forgotten albums and municipal archives. A mother seated at the center, hands folded with deliberate calm. A father standing slightly behind her, his posture rigid, eyes narrowed against the sun. 3 children posed in descending height, scrubbed clean, their expressions hovering between patience and fatigue. They are framed by the wooden siding of their home, the year stamped faintly on the reverse, 1897. Their smiles are not joyful, but practiced, expressions held long enough to satisfy the camera's slow gaze. Nothing about them seems unusual. In fact, the longer one looks, the more reassuring the image becomes, as though it wishes to convince the viewer that this moment was peaceful, that this family was safe. It is only when the eye drifts upward, away from the faces and toward the second floor, that the certainty begins to thin. The window behind them is dark, though the rest of the house catches the afternoon light. Curtains are drawn back just enough to suggest someone once stood there. At first, it seems empty. Then the shadow resolves into something more deliberate. An outline too defined to be coincidence, too still to be reflection. What unsettles is not its shape, but its intention. It is positioned as though aware of the photograph being taken, as though it understands the significance of being recorded. There is no distortion, no blur, only a presence that does not belong to the family, nor to the house itself. Once noticed, it cannot be unseen. The longer one studies the image, the more the smiles below begin to feel strained, their cheerfulness bordering on compliance. It becomes impossible to shake the impression that the family knew it was there. Worse still is the growing suspicion that the thing in the window is not watching them at all. It is looking directly at you. The photograph does not arrive with ceremony. It is discovered the way many forgotten things are, filed incorrectly, mislabeled, resting among hundreds of other brittle prints that smell faintly of dust and chemical age. An archivist finds it while cataloging late 19th century family portraits donated by an estate with no surviving relatives. The envelope is plain, the handwriting on it faded to a near smudge, offering nothing more than a surname and a year. At first glance, it appears indistinguishable from countless others taken during that era, sepia, toned, stiffly composed, the subjects arranged with the careful precision demanded by early cameras and long exposure times. The family stands outside a modest wooden house, their clothing clean but worn, suggesting modest means rather than poverty. Their faces carry the familiar restraint of the period. No laughter, no movement, only polite obedience to the moment. The father's hand rests lightly on the back of a chair. The mother's posture is straight despite the evident discomfort of remaining still, and the children seem caught between boredom and curiosity. It is the kind of image historians see every day, useful primarily for studying fashion, posture, or domestic architecture of the late 1800s. Nothing about the photograph demands attention. No visible damage mars it, no stains or tears mark it as special. The exposure is clean, the focus surprisingly sharp for its age. It could have remained buried indefinitely, another anonymous record of people long dead, if not for the archivist's instinct to set it aside for high-resolution restoration. The institution has recently begun digitizing its older materials, enhancing them carefully to preserve detail before time erases what remains. During the initial scan, the software flags nothing unusual. The tones balance well, the contrast responds predictably. Even under magnification, the image behaves as expected for its era. Wood grain appears where wood should be, fabric textures resolve cleanly, and the shadows fall naturally, with the implied position of the sun. It is only after the photograph is cataloged and placed among others from the same donation that its quiet strangeness begins to surface. The image has a way of drawing the eye back to it, though no one can quite articulate why. Archivists find themselves returning to it without conscious intention, lingering longer than necessary. There is an odd completeness to it, as though the photograph is not merely a captured moment, but a sealed one, finished in a way that resists interpretation. It feels less like a record and more like a pause, a held breath preserved on paper. At this stage, nothing is openly wrong. The photograph is simply noticed, then remembered, then noticed again. It sits in the archive as an ordinary artifact, quietly waiting for someone to look just a little too closely. The first restorer to work on the photograph approaches it with routine detachment, expecting no surprises beyond the usual challenges of age. Under controlled lighting, the print is placed beneath a magnifying lens, its surface examined for hairline cracks, chemical blotches, or the faint silvering that often creeps along the edges of old emulsions. Everything appears stable. The image has aged well, almost unusually so, as if it has been protected from the slow decay that afflicts most photographs of its era. This alone gives pause, though it is not enough to register as concern. As part of the standard process, the restorer enlarges sections of the image to assess detail loss. The faces sharpen, revealing pores, fine lines, and the faint tension in the muscles around the eyes. The children's shoes show scuffs that suggest restlessness before the shutter closed. The wooden siding of the house displays a repeating grain pattern, warped slightly by time but still consistent. Nothing resists explanation. The house itself seems unremarkable. 2 stories, narrow windows, a pitched roof typical of late 19th century rural construction. It is when the restorer adjusts contrast in the upper portion of the image that something unsettles him, though he cannot immediately say why. The second floor window, partially obscured by shadow, responds differently than expected. Instead of lightening evenly, the darkness inside the frame thickens, as though absorbing the adjustment rather than yielding to it. This is not unheard of. Older prints sometimes behave unpredictably, but the boundary of the shadow appears unnaturally defined. It does not feather into the surrounding wood as other shadows do. It holds its shape. He leans closer, isolating the window in a separate frame. At first, it looks empty. Then the suggestion of depth emerges, a sense that the darkness is not merely an absence of light, but a space with interior dimension. He increases magnification again, and the grain of the photograph begins to rearrange itself into something almost recognizable. Almost. The restorer feels a faint tightening in his chest, the subtle physical response that precedes conscious understanding. There is a shape in the window. He tells himself this immediately, then just as quickly corrects the thought. Shapes are easy to imagine when one expects them. Pareidolia is a known phenomenon, especially when dealing with aged material and digital enhancement. He reduces the contrast, then increases it again, adjusting the exposure in small increments. Each time, the same suggestion returns, stubborn and consistent. It is not random. The darker mass sits at a height that implies intention, positioned where a person might stand if they were looking out. What troubles him most is that the shape does not behave like a reflection. Reflections distort, stretch, borrow light from their surroundings. This darkness does none of that. It remains self-contained. The edges do not blur into the glass, and there is no corresponding light source behind it. The restorer cross references the architectural features of the house, visible elsewhere in the image. The first floor windows reveal interior clutter, faintly illuminated by ambient light. The second floor window reveals nothing but the shape. He pulls back, allowing his eyes to rest on the full photograph again. The family's faces seem unchanged, yet their expressions feel different now that the window has asserted itself. The restorer becomes aware of a subtle imbalance in the composition, a visual weight above the family that presses downward. It creates the irrational impression that the people below are not the subjects of the photograph at all, but supporting elements arranged beneath something else. Attempting to ground himself, he consults the original print under natural light, away from the monitor. The shape is there too, though fainter, requiring effort to see. Once seen, however, it holds. It is impossible to dismiss entirely. The restorer marks the anomaly in his notes, describing it cautiously as an irregular shadow requiring further examination. He avoids stronger language, unwilling to ascribe intention where none has yet been proven. Later, during a routine check, he compares the window to others in photographs from the same collection. Similar houses, similar lighting, similar exposures. None of them produce the same effect. Shadows behave as expected. Interiors remain faintly visible or completely opaque, but never with the same density, never with the same suggestion of form. The realization arrives slowly and unwelcome. The anomaly is unique to this photograph. As he prepares the file for the next stage of restoration, he notices something else that resists immediate explanation. The shape appears slightly off, center compared to earlier captures, though he cannot be certain. He checks timestamps, overlays the images, and blames minor alignment differences in the scanning process. Still, the impression lingers that the darkness has shifted, not by much, but enough to suggest repositioning. He saves the file and steps away, unsettled by the lingering sense that the window has been watching the process unfold. Long after he leaves the restoration room, the image remains open on the monitor, the second-floor window rendered in high resolution. In the stillness of the lab, the darkness within the frame appears deeper than before, as though it has settled more comfortably into its place. By the time the photograph reaches chemical analysis, the unease surrounding it has hardened into professional curiosity. Digital anomalies can be blamed on software or scanning artifacts, but chemistry does not indulge imagination. The print is transferred to a controlled environment, handled with gloves and measured patience, where the layers of its existence can be examined without interpretation. The goal is simple: determine whether the shadow in the window is a defect introduced later, a contamination, or a result of aging processes that mimic form. The emulsion is sampled at the edges first, where alterations often announce themselves. Microscopic inspection reveals a uniform distribution of silver particles, remarkably intact for a photograph more than a century old. There are no signs of retouching, no irregular concentrations that suggest overpainting or manipulation. The chemical composition matches that of commercially available photographic materials from the late 19th century. Nothing modern has touched it. The image is, by all measurable standards, authentic. Attention then turns to the window itself. Under magnification, the area shows the same emulsion density as the rest of the photograph, yet the tonal values behave differently. The darkness is not a void but a concentration, a deliberate gathering of exposed material. Light, sensitive compounds have reacted there as though something substantial interrupted the light during exposure. This is not staining, not oxidation, not the creeping fog of time. It is exposure, plain and undeniable. The analyst overlays chemical maps of the image, comparing density gradients across the photograph. The family members register as expected, their forms clearly interrupting the background light. The house's siding produces predictable patterns. The window, however, displays a vertical density profile inconsistent with an empty interior. It mirrors, disturbingly well, the profile of a standing figure partially obscured by shadow. The analyst pauses longer than necessary over this result, recalculates, then repeats the test using a different method. The outcome does not change. Historical photographs sometimes reveal unintended presences. Passing animals, blurred figures who moved too quickly, reflections mistaken for bodies. These always leave signatures of motion or distortion. This does not. The exposure within the window is stable, centered, and deliberate. Whatever stood there did not move. It remained still for the duration of the exposure, long enough for the chemicals to respond fully. The implication settles slowly, resisted at first, then reluctantly accepted. Further tests are conducted to rule out double exposure. None is found. The chemical layering is singular, continuous, uninterrupted. There is no evidence that another image was superimposed later. The photograph was taken once, and what it captured was present at that moment. The analyst documents these findings with careful, neutral language, but the act of writing feels insufficient, as though the words are failing to fully contain what the data suggests. Archival research accompanies the analysis. The camera type likely used is identified, along with its exposure time under similar lighting conditions. Calculations suggest that any figure visible in the window would have needed to remain motionless for several seconds. A living person could manage this, but the house's interior layout complicates that assumption. Records indicate that the second floor had no open space behind that window, only a narrow storage area not intended for occupancy. There would have been no reason for anyone to stand there, let alone remain perfectly still. The analyst revisits the chemical data once more, focusing on the edges of the shadow. The boundary is clean, neither bleeding nor feathering as shadows typically do when filtered through glass. This suggests proximity to the window pane, as though the source of the interruption was pressed close to the glass itself. The thought is dismissed as speculative, yet it refuses to leave entirely. When the report is shared with the restoration team, the room grows quiet in a way that feels disproportionate to the information presented. No one challenges the findings. They ask clarifying questions, request copies of the data, but no one laughs it off. There is a shared understanding, unspoken but present, that the photograph has crossed from curiosity into something else. It has asserted a claim to reality that cannot be easily ignored. One restorer points out that chemical authenticity does not explain intent. Another counters that chemistry does not fabricate figures. The discussion circles cautiously, never venturing into language that might sound unprofessional, yet edging closer to it with every exchange. The photograph resists being reduced to process and procedure. It demands acknowledgement of what it shows. Late that evening, after most of the team has left, the analyst returns to the lab to review the data once more. The print rests beneath protective glass, unchanged and patient. Under the sterile lights, the family's faces appear calm, their expressions frozen in polite endurance. The window above them holds its darkness without variation, the figure within it no clearer than before, yet no less present. The final confirmation comes almost incidentally. A comparative test is run using a blank exposure plate from the same era, subjected to identical chemical treatments. It behaves as expected. No shapes emerge, no false figures suggest themselves. The anomaly belongs solely to the photograph. It is not an artifact of process, nor a trick of decay. It is a record. The analyst signs off on the report with steady handwriting, noting that the figure in the window was present at the time the photograph was taken, captured by the same light that illuminated the family below. There is no margin left for error, no space for dismissal. The photograph has done exactly what it was designed to do, and in doing so, it has preserved something that was never meant to be remembered. Once the photograph's authenticity is confirmed, attention turns outward, away from chemicals and lenses and toward the lives captured in the image. Names once faint on the envelope are traced through census records, property ledgers, and parish registries. The surname appears briefly and without distinction, belonging to a family of modest means who settled on the edge of a growing township in the late 19th century. Birth records align neatly with the apparent ages of the children in the photograph. A marriage certificate matches the man and woman posed at the center. For a time, the research proceeds smoothly, offering the comfort of structure and chronology. Then the trail thins. The census following the year of the photograph lists the house as unoccupied, not sold, not burned, not repurposed, simply empty. The family's names do not appear elsewhere in the county. Tax records show no transfer of property, no delinquency, no explanation for the sudden abandonment. Church attendance rolls note the family's regular presence until early autumn of that year, then mark them absent without comment. There is no record of burial, no mention of illness, no scandal preserved in local papers. At first, this absence is attributed to migration. Families moved often during that period, sometimes without documentation, drawn westward by work or land. But further searches reveal no trace of them elsewhere. Neighboring towns yield nothing. State archives return only silence. It is as though the family ceased to exist within weeks of the photograph being taken, leaving behind no footprint beyond that single image. The local newspaper from the period is examined next, page by brittle page. Fires, floods, crimes, even minor disputes are catalogued in meticulous detail. There is no mention of a missing family, no inquiry, no concern. This absence feels deliberate in its own way, as though the question was never asked. One small article notes that the house stood empty for some time before being quietly dismantled, its lumber reused. No reason is given, no curiosity expressed. Researchers begin to feel the same pull that the photograph itself exerts, a sense that the story resists being told. Oral histories collected decades later mention the property only in passing, described vaguely as an unlucky place, better forgotten. When pressed, descendants of neighboring families recall being warned away from the house as children, told not to linger near its remains. No one can say why. No one claims direct knowledge. The timeline narrows. The photograph is dated to late summer. Church records indicate the family's last confirmed attendance occurred 2 weeks later. After that, nothing. No departures logged at the rail station. No wagon rentals. No farewells witnessed. The house appears to have been left intact. Personal belongings undisturbed until time and weather claimed them. This detail unsettles the researchers more than outright destruction would have. Leaving without taking anything suggests haste, fear, or compulsion. A weather report from that month is reviewed. No storms severe enough to explain a tragedy. Law enforcement records from the period show no investigations tied to the address. It is as if the family's disappearance occurred beneath notice, slipping between the cracks of record, keeping and memory alike. This is not common for 5 people, including children. Someone should have noticed. Someone should have asked questions. The photograph begins to feel less like a record of family life and more like a boundary marker. Before it, the family exists in fragments of ink and paper. After it, they vanish completely. The image becomes the last proof that they were ever there at all. This realization shifts how the researchers view it. The smiles, once merely restrained, now seem laden with something else. A sense of finality settles over their expressions, subtle but unmistakable once considered. One historian notes that disappearances without documentation often indicate intentional erasure, though by whom and for what purpose remains unclear. Another suggests that rural communities sometimes handled unsettling events quietly, choosing silence over scrutiny. Neither explanation satisfies. Silence leaves too much untouched. Erasure implies effort, and there is no evidence of that either. As the findings are compiled, a pattern emerges not of violence or flight, but of withdrawal. The family does not scatter or resurface. They simply stop being recorded. The house is dismantled. The land is absorbed. Names fade from ledgers. Memory closes over the gap as though it were always meant to be there. The photograph alone resists this closing, holding the moment open with stubborn clarity. Those involved in the research find themselves returning to the image again and again, not out of obligation, but compulsion. It feels increasingly like a witness, less to a disappearance than to a threshold crossed. The window above the family takes on new significance in this context, no longer just an anomaly, but a presence positioned precisely at the moment before everything else is lost. The conclusion, when it forms, does so reluctantly. Whatever happened to the family began after the photograph was taken. Yet something in the image suggests it had already begun. The smiles seem rehearsed for an ending they could not avoid. The house, now gone, feels like a container emptied of its contents, and the figure in the window, unchanged by time or scrutiny, stands as the only thing that did not leave, did not vanish, did not need to be searched for, waiting where it has always been. The first sketch appears almost by accident. One of the junior restorers asked to document her impressions of the photograph. Before further enhancement, absent-mindedly draws while waiting for a file to load. Her pencil moves without much thought, tracing the outline of the house as she remembers it. When she reaches the second floor, her hand slows. She hesitates, then adds a vertical shape inside the window. Narrow at the top, broader at the shoulders, tapering again as it descends. Only after she finishes does she realize what she has drawn. The shape unsettles her, but she assumes it is merely the result of suggestion, the image lingering too vividly in her mind. Days later, during an informal discussion, another restorer produces his own notes. He has been trying to describe the anomaly in words, but finds them inadequate. Instead, he turns his notebook around and shows a rough sketch meant to clarify his thinking. The room falls quiet. The drawing is unmistakably similar. The same proportions, the same placement within the window, even the same suggestion of posture. No one mentions the resemblance at first. They exchange glances, each aware that acknowledging it gives it weight. A third sketch surfaces a week later. This one from a technician who has not worked directly on the image, but has seen it briefly during a review meeting. He claims the drawing came from a dream he had afterward, insisting he did not intend to reproduce anything specific. Yet the figure he draws matches the others closely enough to strip the claim of coincidence. The head is slightly bowed. The shoulders are too still, too deliberate. There are no facial features, only the implication of where they should be. Attempts are made to rationalize the phenomenon. The photograph has been discussed openly. Contamination of memory is possible. People influence one another without realizing it. But when the sketches are compared more closely, the similarities extend beyond general shape. Small details align, the angle of the shoulders, the way the figure seems to lean forward just enough to suggest attention. None of these details are clearly visible in the photograph itself. They exist only as impressions, yet those impressions are shared with unnerving precision. What disturbs the team most is the certainty with which each person recalls drawing the figure. There is no hesitation in their memory, no sense of invention. They describe the act as retrieval rather than creation, as though the image was already present somewhere behind their eyes, waiting to be transferred onto paper. When asked to redraw it later, without looking at their original sketches, they reproduce it again with minimal variation. The sketches are eventually collected and stored with the case file, though no one likes the idea of keeping them. They feel less like documentation and more like echoes, repetitions that strengthen something by giving it form. After that, people stop sketching altogether, not because they are told to, but because the impulse itself begins to feel intrusive, as if responding to it might invite further participation in something they do not fully understand and are no longer certain they wish to understand at all. Discovery is made through comparison rather than revelation. As part of routine documentation, each stage of the restoration is archived, allowing technicians to track even the smallest changes introduced by cleaning, contrast adjustment, or resolution enhancement. When these versions are aligned side by side, the expectation is consistency. The photograph should not change in any meaningful way beyond clarity. At first glance, it does not. The family remains fixed, the house unchanged, the shadows where they have always been. It is only when the window is isolated across multiple iterations that the discrepancy emerges. The darkness within it appears fractionally repositioned, so subtle that it escapes notice unless measured. A technician overlays the images digitally, expecting perfect alignment. Instead, the shape within the window refuses to settle into a single outline. Its upper portion leans slightly left in one version, slightly right in another. The difference is minimal, the kind that could be dismissed as processing variance. Yet it persists across methods and software. Efforts are made to attribute the shift to mechanical error. Scanners are recalibrated. Monitors are checked. Files are reprocessed from the original source. Each time, the result is the same. The family's faces align exactly. The wooden siding matches grain for grain. Even imperfections in the print remain fixed. Only the darkness in the window behaves as though it possesses independence from the rest of the image. Measurements confirm what instinct already suggests. The figure's center of mass has moved by a few pixels between stages, always within the boundaries of the window, never crossing the frame. The movement is not random. It suggests repositioning rather than drift, a change in stance rather than distortion. The implication unsettles those who witness it because it contradicts the fundamental nature of a photograph as a static record. One technician points out that enhanced detail can create the illusion of movement, but the explanation fails under scrutiny. Enhancements sharpen existing information. They do not invent new spatial relationships. Here, the relationships themselves appear altered. The figure seems closer to the glass in later versions, its outline more assertive, its presence more difficult to dismiss. Yet no new data has been added. The original exposure remains the sole source. As awareness of the shift spreads, the room takes on a different atmosphere. Conversations lower. People speak in careful terms, choosing words that maintain professional distance. Still, glances return again and again to the aligned images on the screen, to the subtle evidence that something within the photograph is not content to remain fixed. The idea takes hold that observation itself might be a factor, that each act of examination encourages a response. No one suggests this aloud, but behavior changes nonetheless. Fewer enhancements are attempted. The image is handled more cautiously, as though it might react to intrusion. The window becomes the focal point of every discussion, its boundaries now understood not as limits, but as containment. When the final alignment is saved, the technician notices one last inconsistency. In the most recent version, the darkness sits closer to the center of the window than it ever has before, balanced with deliberate symmetry. It appears less like a shadow caught by chance and more like something that has chosen where to stand, Waiting patiently for whatever comes next, the architectural review begins as a formality, a way to ground the investigation in physical reality. Old houses are often altered over time, windows added or sealed, rooms repurposed according to need. To explain the anomaly, researchers seek original plans, tax sketches, or municipal permits that might account for an unusual interior space. The house's address, though no longer standing, appears in early township maps, its footprint roughly outlined among other properties of the era. What emerges is not clarification, but contradiction. The earliest available plans show a simple two-story structure with a steep roof and a central staircase. The second floor contains 2 bedrooms and a narrow storage loft. No window is marked on the upper facade, where the photograph clearly shows one. At first, this is assumed to be an omission, common in older records. But additional documents confirm the absence. Property tax diagrams, insurance maps, and even a carpenter's ledger detailing repairs to the house all depict the same layout. The window does not exist. To rule out error, comparable houses built by the same contractor are examined. They share the same proportions, the same placement of windows and doors. None include an opening where the photograph's window appears. The conclusion grows more difficult to avoid. The structure, as built, should not have had that window at all. It was never planned, never approved, never acknowledged. Attention shifts to the physical constraints of the interior. Based on room dimensions and roof pitch, there would have been no wall space behind that section of the facade, only the slanted underside of the roof. A person could not stand there, let alone be framed by a window. The photograph contradicts the house's geometry, presenting an opening into a space that does not exist. This discovery alters the tone of the investigation. Until now, the anomaly could be discussed as an image problem, a trick of light or perception. Now it extends into the realm of the physical, challenging the assumption that the photograph depicts a coherent reality. The window is not merely unusual, it is impossible. When this finding is shared with the team, reactions vary from disbelief to quiet resignation. Some suggest undocumented modifications, a window cut without record. But the absence of interior framing marks, combined with the roof structure, makes this unlikely. Others argue the photograph may have been altered, but chemical analysis has already closed that door. The house, as remembered and recorded, did not contain that opening. Yet the photograph insists that it did. The contradiction cannot be resolved by choosing one source over the other. Both are authentic. Both are complete. They cannot coexist, and yet they do. From this point on, the photograph is no longer treated as a representation of the house. It is understood as something else entirely, a moment in which the house appears to have been different than it ever was before or after. The window becomes a breach rather than a feature, an aperture that opens not into a room, but into a discrepancy. And the figure within it, no longer anchored to architecture or logic, stands in a space that has no place to belong, held in the image by the same light that binds everything else. Refusing to be explained, refusing to be reconciled, the effect is first noticed indirectly, dismissed as coincidence until it repeats often enough to demand attention. While digitizing unrelated photographs stored in the same archival drawer, a technician pauses over an image of a church picnic taken decades later and miles away. In the background, barely visible through the grain, is a familiar darkness framed by a second-story window. The building is different. The year is wrong. Yet the shape is unmistakable. The technician assumes contamination, perhaps a software glitch or a transfer error, and flags the file for review. More instances surface. A factory group portrait shows a similar vertical smear where no shadow should be. A schoolhouse photograph reveals a faint suggestion of depth behind an upper window that architectural records insist was sealed. In each case, the darkness is weak, almost apologetic, as though it has not fully asserted itself. But the resemblance cannot be ignored. When the files are traced back, all of them share one detail at some point. They were stored digitally or physically adjacent to the original family photograph. The working theory is degradation. That damaged data has blood between files. Tests are run to isolate the cause. Clean copies of the unaffected photographs are restored from backup, reprocessed independently, and compared. The shape returns only when the images are once again placed near the original file. It does not overwrite them. It stains them lightly, leaving behind a suggestion rather than a statement. Those involved begin to describe the phenomenon in reluctant metaphors. They speak of imprinting, of pressure, of proximity effects not accounted for in any archival manual. The photograph seems to behave less like an object and more like a source, radiating something that other images receive whether they are meant to or not. No corruption logs explain it. No timeline fully contains it. What disturbs the team most is the consistency of the shape across unrelated images. It never fully forms, never becomes as clear as it is in the original photograph, but its proportions remain stable. The same narrow upper frame, the same implied shoulders, the same sense of something occupying a space meant to be empty. It does not adapt to new environments. It insists on itself. Precautions are introduced. The photograph is isolated. Digital air gaps are created. Storage protocols are revised. For a time, the spread seems to slow. Then, a printout made for a meeting develops a faint echo of the window after being scanned back into the system. The implication becomes unavoidable. The transmission is not limited to medium. It follows attention. People begin to avoid looking at the image longer than necessary. They minimize its presence on screens, cover it when not in use. Still, the secondary images persist, faint reminders that once seen, the photograph does not remain singular. It reproduces not through copying, but through influence, leaving behind traces of itself in places where it has no historical right to be, as though the act of being observed has given it permission to exist beyond its frame, reaching outward through storage drawers and servers alike, pressing its outline gently but repeatedly into other moments, other buildings, other windows, waiting for enough impressions to accumulate into something that no longer needs the original to remain visible. The final restoration is approached with a restraint that borders on ritual. Every adjustment is logged, every keystroke deliberate, as though care might serve as a boundary. When the image resolves on the screen, in its most complete form, the family remains unchanged, preserved in the stillness they have occupied since the shutter closed. Their expressions are calm, composed, and utterly fixed. The house behind them appears intact, its lines sharp, its textures clarified to the limits of the medium. For a moment, it seems the process has reached a stable conclusion. Then the window asserts itself. What was once contained within its frame no longer respects that containment. The darkness has advanced to the threshold, its edges no longer softened by glass or shadow. The sense of depth has changed. It no longer reads as something behind the window, but something aligned with it, occupying the same plane as the exterior wall. Measurements confirm what the eye already knows. The figure's outline now overlaps the window frame itself, bleeding into the surrounding wood grain without disrupting it. There is no artifacting, no distortion to explain the transition. The photograph remains chemically consistent, the exposure unchanged. Yet the relationship between elements has shifted. The figure is no longer merely observed. It appears positioned to emerge. The most unsettling detail is the gaze. Where no face has ever been visible, there is now a subtle convergence of shadow that suggests orientation. The figure is no longer looking outward in a general sense. It is looking forward. The effect is not dramatic or sudden, but gradual and undeniable, like realizing someone has been standing closer than you thought for some time. Attempts to revert to earlier versions fail. The file resists rollback, restoring itself to the latest state regardless of which backup is loaded. Physical prints behave no differently. Once the final image exists, it appears to overwrite its own history, insisting on the version where the boundary has thinned beyond usefulness. At this point, discussion turns from restoration to containment. The photograph is removed from active systems, sealed in controlled storage. Access is limited. Viewing time is reduced. Yet reports continue to surface of the figure, appearing elsewhere, not as a copy, but as an intrusion. Windows in unrelated images feel deeper than they should. Shadows take on a familiar weight. The outline is rarely clear, but it is always recognized. The understanding arrives without consensus, each person grasping it alone before finding it reflected in others' behavior. The photograph was never a passive record. It was a door held open by attention, by examination, by the repeated act of bringing the image closer. The family did not vanish after the photograph was taken. They were simply no longer the last thing the photograph was meant to hold. In the final archived version, the window is no longer empty and no longer full. The figure occupies a position that suggests transition, as though it has reached the limit of what the image can contain and has begun to test what lies beyond it. No longer content to remain framed by wood and glass. No longer willing to be witnessed without response. Waiting at the precise moment when the photograph stops being something you look at and becomes something that looks back.